The world was changing. The global balance of power was shifting, and the stage was set for a battle that no one could ignore. In 2025, the trade war between China and the United States had reached a boiling point. The stakes? Everything. As tariffs soared and tensions rose, China stood its ground, refusing to back down. But behind the headlines, something even bigger was happening. China was not just fighting back, it was building a new world order. Would the U.S. hold its position as the global superpower? Or was this the beginning of a new chapter where China led the way? The world was watching, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 1. The stage is set. 2025. It's 2025. The world is on edge. Can you feel it? The tension in the air? It's thick, heavy. Everywhere you turn, the talk is the same. The trade war between China and the United States has reached new heights. It's been years now, but this is different. It's no longer just about tariffs and trade deals. It's about power. It's about survival. The year began quietly, but something was shifting. You could feel it if you were paying attention. The pressure building, the whispers in the halls of power, the calm before the storm. In Beijing, the leaders meet behind closed doors. The air inside those rooms is thick with uncertainty. They are talking, arguing, making decisions, important decisions, decisions that will change everything. The world is watching closely. Everyone wants to know the same thing. What will China do? Will they sit back, stay quiet, or will they finally make their move? The pressure on China is growing. The United States has increased its tariffs again. More goods are taxed, more money lost. The Chinese economy, once so powerful, is now feeling the strain. Jobs are being lost. Factories are closing. But in those closed rooms in Beijing, the question is asked again. What now? There's a feeling that the world is holding its breath. It's as if everyone knows a big decision is coming, the kind of decision that will shape the future. No one can predict what will happen next, but one thing is clear: China isn't backing down. China has always been strong, but this feels different. The weight of it all is heavy. The global economy, the stability of nations, the future of millions of people, it's all at risk. And as the pressure mounts, the world watches with eyes wide open, waiting for a response. China's leaders know they can't let the world push them around. They've come too far, built too much. But how will they respond? What will they do when their backs are against the wall? The question echoes through the streets of Beijing, through the markets, through the homes of everyday people. Will China fight back, or will they surrender? In the heart of the city, a young man named Li feels the weight of it all. He works at a factory that makes electronics for the American market. But the tariffs have hit hard. Business is slowing. People are nervous. His friends talk about the future. They worry. What if they lose their jobs? What if the factory closes? What if the trade war goes on? Forever. Li lies awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking. The future feels uncertain. The world feels uncertain. He remembers a time when things were easier, when China was growing, booming, expanding. But now it's different. The tension is real. The pressure is real. And then he thinks about his country, China. It's strong. It's proud. But now it faces the greatest test of all. He hears the whispers of those in power. He knows that the leaders of China are meeting, making decisions that will shape the world. Will they stand tall, or will they bend under the pressure? Lee's thoughts are interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. It's a news alert, a headline. U.S. to impose new tariffs on Chinese goods. The room feels colder. The tension in the air seems to grow. This is not just about money anymore. This is about power. This is about the future of China, the future of the world. Lee puts his phone down and looks out the window. The lights of Beijing twinkle in the distance, but the city feels different now. The world feels different. The stakes have never been higher. Will China strike back, or will they stay silent? It's the question that everyone is asking. And soon the world will know the answer. The leaders are preparing. The people are waiting. And the world holds its breath. The next move will be China's. The clock is ticking. The stage is set. And the story is just beginning. Chapter 2. The War Begins, How It All Started. It's hard to believe it all started back in 2018. So much has happened since then. But what really sparked the trade war? Was it just about tariffs? Or was there something deeper, something bigger? Let's go back, way back, to the beginning. In 2018, the United States made a bold move. President Donald Trump, new in office, had made it clear that he wanted to change things. The U.S., he said, was losing to China. Losing in trade, losing in technology, and losing in power. And something had to be done about it. So he made a decision. A big decision. He imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. The idea was simple. Make China pay for unfair trade practices. The message was clear. If you want to keep selling your goods in our country, you're going to have to pay more. But China didn't just sit back and accept it. No, they didn't. They had their own thoughts. You think this is the answer? China thought. You think we will just bend to your will? The tariffs hit China hard. China, which had been growing faster than any country in history, suddenly saw its economy slow. Factories that had once hummed with activity now sat quiet. Workers were losing jobs. Businesses that had thrived for years now found themselves struggling. There were protests in the streets. People were angry. They weren't just angry about money. They were angry about something deeper. It wasn't just about the economy. It was about respect. It was about power. China had built its strength over many years. They had fought hard to get where they were. And now, the United States was telling them that they didn't deserve it? That everything they had built was somehow unfair. China was proud. They were not going to back down. "We will not be bullied," China said, quietly, but with determination. The people of China felt it too. The leaders in Beijing made it clear, "We will fight for what is ours." But this was more than just about a few tariffs. This was a message, a declaration. The U.S. thought it could push China around, but China wasn't going to let that happen. And so, the trade war began. As the war started, both sides dug in. The U.S. imposed more tariffs, and China responded with tariffs of its own, back and forth. The world watched as the two giants clashed. Neither side would give in. It was like a game of chess, with the entire global economy hanging in the balance. But deep down, both sides knew that this wasn't just about trade. No, this was about something much more important. It was about power. It was about who would control the future. In Beijing, the leaders were calm, but their eyes burned with determination. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they were ready to defend what they had worked so hard to build. The U.S. was also determined. President Trump, with his aggressive tactics, believed this was the only way to make China respect American power. And for him, it wasn't just about money. It was about restoring what he saw as America's place at the top. The question was, who would blink first? For months, the world held its breath. Each new tariff, each new round of talks seemed to bring more tension. Could they find a way to negotiate? Could they come to an agreement? Or was this the beginning of something much larger, something that could change the global balance of power forever? The stakes were high. On both sides, there was a sense of urgency, and as the world watched, the fear began to grow. What would happen next? Would the U.S. back off? Or would China make the first real move? There was no turning back now. The world was already deep into the trade war. The leaders were ready. The pressure was building. And the outcome? It was anyone's guess. But one thing was clear. The fight was only just beginning. Chapter 3. Trump's tariffs. The pressure builds. It was only a matter of time before President Trump pushed harder. He didn't just stop at the first round of tariffs. He increased them. Again and again. First, it was 25%, then 50%, even higher. Every time the world thought the pressure had reached its peak, Trump pushed even further. The tariffs were crushing. You could feel it in the air. The weight of them was heavy. Heavy for China, and heavy for the world. China had worked so hard, so many years of growth, of building, of rising to the top. But now, all of that was at risk. The economy, once booming, started to slow. Exports began to fall. Goods that China had once sold easily around the world were now too expensive. People began to notice. Companies in China that relied on exports began to struggle. Some even closed. Workers who had once felt secure in their jobs were now sent home. For many, it felt like a storm that was growing stronger every day. In Beijing, The leaders were under pressure. They knew they couldn't just sit back and let this happen. They couldn't ignore the pain. The economy was struggling, and they had to act. But how? What could they do? Meanwhile, across the ocean in Washington, D.C., President Trump stood tall. He didn't back down. He claimed victory. He spoke to the American people. The tariffs are working, he said. China is feeling the pressure. This is the right thing to do. We will win this fight. But China wasn't ready to admit defeat. No, they were stronger than that. They had faced challenges before. This was nothing new to them. It was hard, yes. It hurt, yes. But they had always found a way to stand strong. The question now was, when would China act? They knew the pressure was building. The world was watching. The time for action was coming. But would it be soon enough? China's leaders met in secret. They discussed, debated, planned. They knew that retaliation was the only way forward. They couldn't just sit by and let the U.S. continue to push them around. But how? And when? Every day, the tension grew. The workers, the families, the people of China felt it. They talked in the streets, in the markets. What would happen next? How much longer could they take this pressure? And yet, despite everything, China refused to give up. They refused to bend under the weight of those tariffs. There was too much at stake, too much pride, too much history. We will not be defeated, they said. We will find a way. But as the days passed, one thing became clear. China had to make a move. If they didn't, the cost would only rise. Every hour that passed was another hour of suffering. There was a moment, a quiet moment, when the leaders of China realized they had to act now. The world was waiting, holding its breath. They began to prepare. Retaliation was coming. It was inevitable. But when? And how? In the streets of China, people didn't know when or how. But they could feel it. They could feel the weight of what was coming. It wasn't just about the tariffs. It wasn't just about the money. This was about survival. This was about standing tall. This was about China's future. As the days grew longer and the pressure grew heavier, China held on. And the world waited. Would they fight back, or would they surrender? The moment of truth was coming. But one thing was certain. China wasn't going to give up easily. Chapter 4. Retaliation. China strikes back. The day came. After months of suffering, months of being pushed, the time for action had arrived. China had been waiting, planning, enduring. But now, it was time. China announced its response to the U.S. tariffs. The news spread like wildfire. The tariffs on U.S. goods were now 84%. The reaction was immediate. It was swift. The U.S. felt the sting. 84%? People whispered. This is serious. Goods that had once been cheap now became expensive. American products, everything from cars to electronics, suddenly had a much higher price tag. It wasn't just about a few dollars here and there. No, this was bigger. Much bigger. American farmers who relied on exporting crops to China felt the pain first. Their products, soybeans, wheat, and corn, became too expensive. Chinese buyers no longer wanted them. The farmers watched as their businesses faltered, unable to keep up with the rising costs. And it wasn't just the farmers. American manufacturers, big and small, felt the pressure too. Parts for cars, electronics, and even clothing were all affected. Factories in the U.S. that depended on cheap goods from China now faced the harsh reality of higher prices. Workers were sent home. Jobs were lost. It was a wake-up call. For many in the U.S., it was hard to believe. They had been so sure that the tariffs would hurt China. But now they were feeling the impact themselves. In Beijing, the leaders watched carefully. They knew their move would change everything. "We will not bow to pressure," they said in a statement. Their voices were firm, calm, but there was a strength in their words that could not be ignored. It was a message to the world. China was standing its ground. They were not going to let anyone push them around. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no turning back. But the world? The world had questions. What would happen next? Would this escalate? Would it get worse? Could there be peace? Or was this just the beginning of something much, much larger? The world watched closely, waiting, holding its breath. In the United States, President Trump was not happy. He had made it clear from the start that China was to blame for the trade problems. Now, the U.S. had taken a hit, and it was painful. But Trump didn't back down. He didn't back off. He wasn't going to let China win. "The tariffs are working," he said. "China has to come to the table. They have no choice." But China wasn't coming to the table just yet. They had shown their strength, and now they waited. The question was, would the U.S. back down? Or would both sides keep fighting, pushing each other harder and harder? Back in China, there was a quiet, confident sense of determination. The leaders weren't afraid. They had prepared for this. They knew they would face difficulties, but they were ready. They had the strength to endure. Still, the pressure was immense. People in China knew what was at stake. Would the U.S. continue its attacks? Would China be able to withstand the pressure? In the markets of Beijing, people talked about what had happened. They knew the tariffs were only the beginning. "This is just the start of something bigger," they said. "We have to be ready." But what did ready mean? What could China do next? The answers weren't clear. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if peace was still possible, or if the situation would only get worse. And as the days passed, the question lingered in the air. Would this lead to war? Or could the two countries find a way to talk, to work it out? In the streets of China, in the quiet rooms of Beijing, and in the offices of Washington, D.C., the same thought was on everyone's mind. This war had only just begun. Chapter 5. The World. Reacts, Media, and Politics. The world was shocked. When China announced its 84% tariffs, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. The reactions came fast. Everyone had an opinion. Some people cheered. Some people feared the worst. In the media, it was chaos. The headlines screamed, "China fights back. China strikes hard." The excitement was palpable. Some saw this as a victory for China, a strong move, a message to the world. China would not be bullied. It would stand its ground. But not everyone saw it that way. Others were worried, very worried. The global economy is at risk, the pundits cried. This could lead to disaster. They warned that the conflict might escalate. The fear was real. The world economy, which had already felt the pressure of the trade war, was now in even more danger. Could this be the beginning of something much bigger? Something no one could control? Politicians around the world scrambled to respond. Leaders in Europe, Latin America, and Russia all had to take a stand. What would they say? Whose side were they on? Some politicians stood with China, agreeing that they had every right to retaliate. The U.S. cannot expect to act without consequences, they argued. China has been pushed too far. Others took the opposite view. They sided with the U.S., calling for an end to the tariffs. Peace talks must begin, they said. This is a dangerous game, and it's time to stop. The global community was torn. Behind closed doors, leaders were meeting. They weren't just reacting to China and the U.S. They were also thinking about their own countries. The world had changed. The trade war wasn't just between two nations anymore. Number now. Everyone was involved. Everyone was affected. Europe, Russia, and Latin America all had their own concerns. They began to form alliances. Leaders talked quietly. What would this mean for them? Would they support one side or the other? Or would they try to stay out of it, hoping for peace? No one could be sure. In Europe, some leaders saw this as an opportunity to take a more active role in global politics. They worried that a divided world would hurt them. They didn't want to be stuck in the middle, forced to pick a side. But others were more cautious. We must be careful, they said. The risk is too high. In Russia, the mood was different. They saw China's response as a sign of strength. Many in Russia supported China's right to stand firm against the United States. But there was no denying that the world was now walking a very dangerous path. Everyone knew it could explode into something much bigger. And then there was Latin America. Countries here were nervous too. The trade war was affecting them. Goods that were once easy to buy and sell were now harder to come by. People in Latin America felt the pressure. They didn't want to get caught in the middle of a fight between two of the world's biggest powers. But it was impossible to ignore. They had to choose. The world watched. People in every country were glued to their screens, waiting for news. What would happen next? Would China and the U.S. back down? Or would they continue to escalate? Could peace be possible? Or was the world heading toward an even greater conflict? In China and the US, the leaders knew what was at stake. This was no longer just a trade war. This was about global power. This was about control of the future. China's response had shaken the world. It had sent a clear message. China was not afraid. China was not going to surrender. But as the world watched, there was still a question everyone was asking. Where would this lead? Was this the beginning of something larger? A new global order? Or would the world find a way to stop the madness? In every corner of the globe, the fear was growing. The sense of uncertainty was everywhere. Could this end peacefully? Or would the world be torn apart by a war of words, tariffs, and power? The leaders of Europe, Russia, Latin America, and every nation across the globe knew that the next few months would determine the future. The world had to decide. And the world was nervous. As the pressure built, one thing became clear. The world was changing. And no one knew what would come next. Chapter 6. New Allies, China's Strategic Shift. China wasn't waiting around. The United States had made it clear. The tariffs, the pressure, they weren't going to stop. The trade war wasn't ending anytime soon. And China, proud and determined, knew it had to do something. It couldn't just sit back and take it. China needed new allies. And so, China turned its eyes to the world. It reached out to countries like Russia, Brazil, and others who had been watching from the sidelines. They saw an opportunity. China was growing stronger, standing tall against the United States. It was clear. China was no longer going to let the U.S. call all the shots. Russia saw it first. The world was changing. The old alliances were weakening. If China was strong enough to stand up to the U.S., maybe it was time to join forces. The two countries signed trade deals. Agreements were made. China and Russia were now partners. It wasn't just Russia. Brazil, with its vast resources, also saw a chance to benefit. Brazil was dealing with its own economic struggles, and a partnership with China could help. They didn't hesitate. Deals were signed. New trade routes were opened. China's influence in Latin America grew stronger. And it didn't stop there. Countries across Africa, Asia, and Europe began to look at China differently. The old global balance was shifting. China, once the world's factory, was now becoming a global leader. The United States was no longer the only superpower in the room. In Beijing, the leaders watched with quiet confidence. They knew what they had to do. If the U.S. didn't want to play by the rules, China would find new partners. And that's exactly what they did. The message was loud and clear. If the U.S. doesn't want to play by the rules, we'll find new partners. And the world was listening. As the U.S. pressed on with its tariffs and pressure tactics, China responded by expanding its influence. It wasn't just about retaliatory tariffs anymore. It was about creating a new global network, a new world order, where China was no longer just a supplier, but a leader. In the markets of Beijing, people felt the shift. Businesses began to see new opportunities. Chinese companies, once dependent on American markets, now found new buyers. Chinese goods flowed into Russia, Brazil, and beyond. For many, it was a new beginning. But it wasn't just about business. The partnerships China formed were about power. China wasn't just looking for trade deals. It was building relationships that would help it grow stronger. And the U.S.? The U.S. was beginning to feel the heat. The more China reached out, the more the world's power structure shifted. Countries that once relied on the U.S. for trade, security, and influence were now looking at China with new eyes. At the same time, the U.S. felt more and more isolated. The tariffs were not just hurting China, they were hurting the U.S. as well. Farmers, manufacturers, and everyday Americans were paying the price. The global economy was becoming more unpredictable. And all the while, China was quietly building a new world. The old alliances, the ones that had been in place for decades, were starting to crumble. China was leading a new way. The U.S. had created a divide, and now China was filling the gap. In Washington, D.C., the reaction was mixed. Some leaders were worried. Would the U.S. be able to keep up? Others were hopeful. Maybe the U.S. could find a way to fix the situation. Maybe a deal could be made. But China wasn't rushing. It didn't need to. As the trade war raged on, China's global influence grew. More and more countries were looking to China for leadership. The message from Beijing was clear. We can survive without the U.S. We can thrive without the U.S. And soon, the world was beginning to understand that China wasn't just a global supplier anymore. It was a global leader. The power had shifted, and China, standing tall, was now at the center of it all. What would the future hold? The world was watching, waiting. Would China continue to grow stronger, or would the U.S. find a way to stop it? Would the new alliances last, or would the pressure of the trade war tear them apart? The global landscape was changing, and no one knew what would come next. But one thing was certain. China was no longer just a player in the game. It had become a force in its own right, and the world would never be the same.